The government says there'll be no further work on what caused the mass die-off of shellfish on England's northeast coast in 2021. The DEFRA Secretary, Therese Coffey, says, given the extent of the analytical work already undertaken, I've decided it's highly unlikely we will ever find the cause, so no further analysis will be undertaken by the government. She also says there is no question of the government providing compensation. Well, as you may remember, there's been an ongoing row over what caused the deaths of so many crabs and lobsters. Most recently, as we reported last month, an independent panel of experts set up by the government found that a new pathogen was as likely as not to be the problem. But other scientists who conducted a review commissioned by local fishermen insist a chemical called pyridine, linked to the industrial past of the port, is a more likely cause. I've been speaking to Dr. Carrie Caldwell from Newcastle University for BBC Countryfile.
We maintain with University of Liverpool a series of long-term environmental monitoring sites around the UK coast. One of those sites happens to be at Staithes, and we survey that on an annual basis going back many, many years. The 2022 survey, when we went down and did it, we looked initially at the barnacle population. There were no barnacles at all on the lower and mid-shore, and only a smattering of barnacles left on the upper shore.
Actually, that's really clear, isn't it? Because every year you've had barnacles,
Yep.
and then it's actually empty.
Empty, bare
on the
rock.
low and the mid, and just a very few there
Yep.
at the high.
Pyridine is a really important ingredient in many anti-fouling chemicals that are made for paints that go onto ships and offshore rigs to stop barnacles from settling, and those that do settle to kill them off.
Dr. Gary Caldwell. The independent panel found it was very unlikely that the deaths were caused by toxic pollutants or maintenance dredging at the port. That panel was chaired by DEFRA's Chief Scientific Advisor, Professor Gideon Henderson.
Well, it is true that this is a highly polluted area, but you must remember also that crabs died along at least 70 kilometres of shoreline over at least 2 months. For that sort of thing to be explained by toxic release, there'd have to be repetitive, continuous toxic release at a level far in excess, thousands of times higher than any source of toxins that the expert panel could find.
If there was a pathogen, shouldn't we be really worried about it? Because the level of movement coming in and out of the port means that's travelling around the country, around the world.
Well, reiterate that there is no direct evidence of a pathogen, and the panel considered it about as likely as not that a pathogen would explain the incidents. It's getting now increasingly difficult to think we can really understand what happened in 2021. But one thing that I think is important is that scientifically we are more ready if there were to be another incident like this.
Professor Gideon Henderson speaking to me on Countryfile last night. Joe Redfern represents the North East Fishing Collective.
Well, it leaves us with more questions than answers, unfortunately, and while the dredging continues, it leaves us waiting to see what happens.
Do you think actually Professor Gideon Henderson is perhaps right when he says we'll probably never know for definite what this was?
Well, there is going to be elements of uncertainty, as with everything, but to come out with a unevidenced alternative theory just seems wild to me. You know, we should be putting all our resources into trying to understand the thread of evidence that we have as completely as possible, and unfortunately that's not being done.
So you think, despite what the independent inquiry has said, that this is down to dredging?
Yeah, why aren't we doing core hole testing into the sediment? Why aren't we testing that sediment before it is dumped at sea? Or at least, you know, regularly, every week, testing a bit of that sediment and analysing it before then dumping it at sea.
The government, though, has no plans to do that because they accept the independent panel's report. Is that something that you or scientists working on your behalf could or would do?
Yeah, when it shouldn't be our responsibility to do so, but we're crowdfunding through the fishermen's associations, we're working with local universities, we're trying to get the permissions in place to get that sampling done, but, you know, a big barrier is cost.
Is there a point at which you and fishermen along the coast just have to accept that you may never know for certain what caused this?
Yeah, there is. And if the testing comes back as clean and they test for pyridine and find that pyridine isn't toxic in the levels that they detect, that's when we'll all hold our hands up and say we accept that the dredging can continue and it's safe to do so. But unfortunately, there's no monitoring and no sampling being done at this time, so we're left waiting to see the impact to the marine life rather than being ahead of the game and trying to monitor it.
What's the situation at the moment with crab and lobster populations?
Just completely devastated around the Tees estuary. Just complete devastation, just loss of earnings, boats going up for sale, crew leaving the industry. You know, it's game over for those guys around there. Further afield, like down to Whitby, where I am, the fishing has continued, albeit that the crab numbers have been really heavily impacted.
Joe Redfern there from the North East Fishing Collective. That's it from us. I'm Charlotte Smith. The studio manager is Nick Ford, and the producer for BBC Audio in Bristol is